Thanks for that introduction, Scott. It actually sounded pretty good, so that's a good thing. Look, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for inviting me to speak at this event. In my previous role as Vice President of Geoscience at BHP, which was over the last 6 years, as Scott said, I focused on two areas of accountability. The first one was technical excellence, and the second, technical assurance. And as you're going to see today, those two are inextricably linked. They're very relevant also to the theme today of managing risk in challenging times. In my new role as Vice President of Technical Capability, I am going to be supporting technical capability development, and that is an area that I'm passionate about. This, in turn, will improve technical excellence and assurance outcomes both now and into the future. In this speech, I'm going to explain why risk management is so important for the resources industry, and I suspect, though, that I am preaching to the converted. I'm going to describe BHP's technical risk journey over the past 5 years. I'm also going to highlight some of the more traditional risks that we need to identify and manage across the resources value chain. And then lastly, I'm going to consider some of the new risks that we need to identify and manage in our rapidly changing world, and we heard of a number of those in the introductory talk. But these do include things that will be hitting us, such as technology, scarcity of quality deposits that sit near surface in geopolitically stable locations, the increasing societal expectations for resource stewardship, environmental management and community sustainability, building technical expertise, we'll talk more about that, and workforce planning. So why is risk identification and management so important for our industry? As geoscientists, we know that our resources don't change, well, not in the assessment and extraction timeframes that we use anyway. But what does change is our understanding of a resource as we collect, analyse, interpret and model data. We need to know what data to collect and how and when to collect it so that we can deliver material value, irrespective of whether it's for an exploration play, resource characterisation, environmental assessment, project development, or planning and extraction optimisation. In over 3 decades of working as a geoscientist, I have observed that fundamental understanding of resources, and that is having the right knowledge to make the right decision at the right time, is the best insurance policy to mitigate against accidental disposal of world-class assets, we've all done that, failure to acquire a world-class asset because we don't recognise its potential, project and operational cost blowouts, or indeed closure of operations due to sub-economic performance. In the words of Billy Joel, and I'm showing my age, get it right the first time, that's the main thing. And yet, due to the cyclical nature of the mining industry, often the first thing to be cut when budgets are reduced is the geoscience data gathering activities that actually would improve the resource understanding. And then, and it often takes a few years to flow through, we see the downstream cost and profit implications when insufficiently verified assumptions fail to materialise. And this can destroy companies. I can think of dozens of examples of lost opportunities or failed projects or failed operations that I've either personally experienced or read about in my career. And I see a number of you nodding in agreement. But as geoscientists, we actually need to take some of the accountability for this outcome. We're not great at explaining the business case to underpin our proposed resource assessment work. And even though the costs are generally very low and value is often high, we don't get that message across as well as we could. And if we consider why resource understanding is so important, it all comes back to identifying our resource risks and managing those risks using a number of controls. Risk management is a continuously maturing journey, one of learning, reassessing and modifying, and particularly in our current times of technological advancement, changing workforce demographics, societal expectations, and automation presenting a material change to the way that we operate. Think about the significant advancement that our industry has made with respect to safety, risk identification and management. This slide shows a contrast between my drill supervision, or not, looking at the faces on those drillers, in Telfer in the mid-80s. Have a look at the fact that we had no safety glasses, we had limited hearing protection, we had no sun protection, but it was 40 degrees many days of the year. We had no guarding or rig exclusion zone, and the list goes on, if I can point out many more things. But we didn't know what we didn't know at that stage. Compare that to the current day. Proud mum, that's my son on the far left-hand side, who's doing a gap year as a drilling offsider. Look at the risk management that they've got. That's a fully automated machine. There's guarding, there's proactive diversity and inclusion, correct PPE, environmental management considerations, etc. And I guess these two contrasting photos show an understanding of risks and management safety has been a journey that we've been on, and that's going to continue to evolve. But in contrast, there's been less emphasis and less communication and education on resource risk management. It's incumbent on all of us to improve this situation. Really, the people that we need to be explaining this to in a very understandable way are the accountants, the finance people who actually have the budgets and choose how they allocate them. Resource risk identification and management are fundamental to our growth and success. Resource risk identification should be a formal process. You should be conducting it at least annually. Planning should include identification of diverse stakeholders to challenge thinking. We don't want groupthink. Participants should include geoscientists, engineers, metallurgists, hydrologists, geotechnical engineers, environmental scientists, finance, legal, projects, and business development personnel as a minimum. The process should be facilitated by an experienced risk professional. If you don't have those in-house, you can bring them in. Material and significant risks should be associated, we should have associated causes identified, and controls should be designed to either prevent or mitigate those risks. Importantly, and we heard it before, upside opportunities should also be identified. I'll talk more about that shortly. This slide shows a simplified, it doesn't look terribly simple, but a simplified example of a generic process map identifying significant and material risks from tenure management through mineral resources and ore reserves. Material risks are managed through the design and effective operation of critical controls. So basically anything that's got a red highlight around the box, we see that is a significant or material risk. Please note that this example forms the basis of an assurance framework for just one portion of the minerals value chain. It's certainly not the complete picture, but I tried to put something that was reasonably simple. Every ore body should be assessed for its own specific risks and critical controls. So we need to form a generic map, and that's a baseline for a customisation then, depending upon what the operational asset is and what its own independent risks might be. It's very important that we recognise two key aspects of risk management. Firstly, protection against downside risk, and I guess this is where traditionally our industry has focused its risk identification and management processes, and maybe that's been influenced by our health and safety journey. This can encourage a conservative risk culture that's not conducive to a growth strategy in a world where access to scarce quality resources is becoming more difficult. But secondly, it's important to identify the upside benefits that you could realise by taking on a certain amount of risk in a controlled way. This provides a risk management framework to position a company to deliver growth through an informed and deliberate strategy. An example of this would be using a mineral systems approach to assess global endowment for a commodity prior to assessing the overarching risks. And certainly a BHP example in the past, geopolitical concerns actually excluded consideration of endowment potential for some parts of the planet. An overly conservative approach that can and should be overhauled by considering upside potential and a strategy that clearly defines what geopolitical criteria would be conducive to taking on some risk and exploring for or acquiring a resource at some stage in the future, or indeed holding ground in readiness for future change. Put simply, know when to take action. Consider what must go right to maximise returns, rather than thinking about, well, what can go wrong? So having set that context, I'd now like to share with you the BHP technical risk management journey that we've been on over the past 5 years. It's seen us adopt a 3 lines of defence model for improved assurance and risk management. The 3 lines of defence model was developed by KPMG for HSBC in the UK in the 1990s. A number of companies now adopt that model. Its use is relatively common in both corporate and public sectors, and it's been adopted also by the Australian Institute of Internal Auditors. The advantage that it brings is that it establishes clear boundaries and responsibilities for each risk and control group. It avoids gaps and duplication. It maximises value, but it actually also minimises the impost on operations, and it delivers strong, integrated and cost-effective assurance across our organisation. So the first line of defence on the far left-hand side is concerned with management controls within our operations, our assets and regions, and it generally has a real-time focus. It's aimed at the practitioner who's doing the work, doing a self-assessment, using external review of governance and compliance processes where it makes sense, to effectively demonstrate that that individual has complied with all of the processes and verification that is within their procedures. The second line of defence, the middle box, focuses on risk oversight for technical activities and has a mandate to review the first line assurance processes. This second line of defence assurance is actually conducted by my old team, the BHP Technical Centre of Excellence, and we managed and control the relevant risk frameworks, and we support and verify the control activities. The aim is to confirm the effectiveness of what the first line is doing, to identify and action any improvements that need to be made, but equally to identify and share good or best practice. And I'll talk about that more shortly. And on the far right-hand side, the third line of defence involves independent assurance that evaluates the adequacy and effectiveness of both the first and second line management activities with respect to risk. This is managed through formal audits that are conducted by our internal audit and advisory group, or indeed their nominated representatives. They're not technical people, so they actually do reach outside BHP for their third line technical audits. Results of what's happening across each 3 lines of defence is then communicated to the BHP Board Risk and Audit Committee. 5 years ago, I was asked how I would undertake the second line of defence assurance process if I was given a blank slate. It was a very, very different world then, where all the audits were formal. We assisted providing technical people to the third line of defence to conduct audits. It was every second year, every asset was audited, and it was a very traditional process. Those processes didn't actually deliver the value that we had hoped that they would be. It was very much an us and them approach. And I guess from a trenches perspective, and we've all been there, you're notified of an upcoming audit. You do a massive amount of spring cleaning. All of a sudden your team becomes a hive of activity because you want to make sure that your house is in order before the auditors get there. And then you cross your fingers and you hope that the auditors fail to discover some of the controls weaknesses that you're aware of but you haven't yet managed to correct. Not to mention the ones that you actually don't know about. And it very much becomes an us and them situation with a predictable process. I've always likened it to skimming a flat stone across a still lake. If there's a material weakness poking its head above the surface, yeah, that system will identify it. But what it does miss is a number of smaller deficiencies that, if they go undetected collectively, they could lead to a future material issue. And I had to lead some investigation teams for exactly that scenario for a few of our assets, which actually got me thinking about how can we improve the situation. It's also important, just for me to clarify, that BHP's internal policy dictates that both new and materially changed resources and reserves estimates need to be fully assessed through an independent deep technical audit that's generally undertaken by external consultants. Those audit reports and progress on any recommended actions are taken into consideration by our internal auditors, both in the old system and then in the new system. So the premise for this revised second line of defence assurance system was all about ensuring currency, relevance and correct application of first line asset and operations risk management frameworks. That was identification and regular reassessment of material and significant risks and associated applications of critical controls to manage those risks. And underpinning this new system were the principles of transparency, trust, and most importantly, collaboration. And it was a journey. I know the first year when we said, right, we're going to start implementing a new system, or at least trialling it, and we actually asked each of the assets to send through to us their current risk bow ties. Currency was a very interesting concept, and some of them couldn't find them. Others had them at their fingertips. Others said, look, here it is, but we haven't looked at it for 4 or 5 years. And that actually showed us the improvement that we needed to make. So how does the system work? Well, on an annual basis, several months before we actually undertake our annual reporting, each asset, including our non-operated joint venture assets, are required to undertake a desktop resources and reserves risk review. And this review is based on the endorsed and current material and significant risks and presence and effective operation of critical controls required to manage the risks across all of the value chain from tenure right through to extraction and indeed reconciliation. Within this framework, there's a pre-work piece. The first line accountable professionals are required to work through and complete a standard checklist to determine whether their defined critical controls are in place and whether they're being operated effectively. All of those responses need to be supported by uploading of evidence into a shared electronic workspace. And then the second line technical risk reviewers, they go through those responses and they look at the evidence provided, they do some follow-up questioning, and they do additional verification if necessary. Then when there's any identified as an outcome of that, identified controls weaknesses and indeed strengths that are worthy of investigating and sharing more broadly, those aspects form the agenda for a face-to-face 1 to 2 day risk review session with that asset or operation. The session seeks to obtain more understanding regarding the controls weaknesses, and in some cases we actually find controls are working correctly, it's just that the wrong evidence was provided. But where there's weaknesses that are confirmed, those inform the scope for our new and very, very important concept, which is a controls effectiveness collaborative assessment, shortened or as an acronym, because BHP loves acronyms. We call it a Seeker process. And everyone right through to the CEO, if you mention the word Seeker, they know what it's about. So I'll elaborate on what Seequent does shortly. But the risk review, as a last piece, also assesses preparedness and addresses any concerns for current year public reporting of resources and reserves. So once we've finished those risk reviews, we do a risk ranking of asset weaknesses, and we use that ranking to determine the annual assurance plan. So we've continued once every 2 years. There will be a Seequent that is conducted at each asset or operation. But where an asset has much, more concerning controls weaknesses, they'll be prioritised ahead of others. So what are the benefits of Seekers compared to traditional auditing? The Seeker team is a collaborative team. It's comprised of both asset and independent experts, but those with deep technical expertise that relate to where the controls weaknesses have been identified. So if you've got controls weaknesses in the area of mine planning, for example, or in geotech, you'll send your team who actually have expertise in that area. So you're not sending more generals, you're actually sending specialists in to really dig in to understand what's going wrong and to collectively share the learnings in terms of root causes, and most importantly, how we actually change and improve and strengthen that control so it works effectively. We also, and it's worth noting, we also do identify good practices, and we share those across the company's technical community. The process is facilitated by a technical centre of excellence leader, so one of my previous team. Also, the technical centre of excellence monitors activities that, in terms of agreed actions that an asset needs to undertake to correct the weakness. And we do that from a technical perspective until such time as we're in agreement that it's been closed out. So the really nice thing about the Seeker process is the asset representatives are on that learning journey, or firstly that forensic journey, then the learning journey in terms of what they've got to do to fix the problem, and then they're obviously on the journey of correction. The feedback that we've got on Seeker from asset and operational personnel has been really encouraging and positive. They appreciate the opportunity to understand their gaps, because sometimes they just don't, until they've actually worked with the experts to help them. They enjoy the fact that they get to learn, and they improve in collaboration with guidance from those experts. And this is a really significant cultural shift from your traditional auditor-auditee, don't necessarily get along, previous model. Transition to the new system, though, has been a journey of learning, adaptation, assessment and correction. And this has been guided by assurance experts, both internal and external to BHP. We've also gone and looked at what other companies do in this space. We think this process is reasonably unique, but it fits perfectly within the 3 lines of defence model. The second line has also been audited a number of times during this process with recommendations on improvement, and we definitely have changed. What we've ended up with in terms of our final product is a little different to what we'd envisaged initially. Now, while the second line of defence assurance system has been in development, we've also worked with our technical experts across the company. So we have a number of technical forums that we work with, which are really the key people across each of the assets, including petroleum. And we've generated an aligned minimum technical suite of standards. So these have been out for, varying lengths of time, but in general about 12 months. They're in a transition period, but from the 1st of January 2020, there will be mandatory component to the seekers and also to the risk reviews to allow us to map back against these to ensure that critical controls meet these minimum requirements. And the standards cover things like endowment assessment, activity planning, sampling and QA/QC, geometallurgy, information management, reconciliation, production accounting, data collection and management, ore deposit and hydrocarbon models, geoscience knowledge and uncertainty, geotechnical design and management, compliance to plan, acid and metalliferous drainage, and water management. So you can see holistically, it's also looking at the environmental management of what we do, as well as the technology considerations for our technical work. And back to the point that I made earlier in this speech, resource understanding requirements are absolutely underpinned by identifying our material risks and collecting the data to quantify and manage these risks. Traditionally, so this is looking at our journey so far as an industry, risks that we know about have been associated with tenure, licence to operate, quality and continuity of mineralisation, the presence of deleterious elements, physical and chemical properties of ore and waste material, extraction performance, hydrology, geomorphology, structural settings, rock mass characterisation, energy requirements and indeed the availability of energy, just to mention a few. So if you're thinking about starting a project, there are all the sorts of things that you consider in terms of your engineering design and ultimately your commitment to proceed into operation, but they all stem back to understanding your resource. In our brave new world of technological advancement and change, and these things include things like sensor technology, automation, changing workforce demographics, machine learning, artificial intelligence, those additional to the societal pressure on environmental management and resource stewardship, we've got to be vigilant and proactive in managing, well, firstly identifying, and then managing a number of new risks that will present themselves. Finally, I'd like to discuss the risk that our industry is facing with respect to technical capability and competency. This is the focus of my new role. It's an area that I've been really passionate about for a number of years. And BHP actually said, right, write your position description and we'll actually support this role because we recognise we can't sit back and hope that it sorts itself out. It does. It's an intervention piece that needs to happen. As an industry, we recognise that we're facing critical shortages of deep technical expertise in specialty areas that we need to manage most of our material risks. We might jest that it's easier to find a unicorn than a tailings engineering specialist, but actually it's no laughing matter. Likewise, we've got limited numbers of subject matter experts in structural geology, geotechnical engineering, geostatistics, sampling and QA/QC, environmental geochemistry, hydrology, geometallurgy, and the list goes on. We've actually got a list within BHP that concern us in terms of bringing up the next generation of experts. For the past couple of years within BHP, we've been producing some advanced TED Talk style e-learning modules in some of these areas using both our in-house and also our external experts. And I guess that really was to fill a need where, we could talk about a competency matrix and we could say, yes, map your skill set against these required competencies, and the individual would identify the gaps, but it was then very hard to know where to go to get the information to fill those gaps. And these e-learning modules they're not University 101, 201, 301, they're more advanced and they're very specific to the industry. So, subject to an agreed industry competency framework, we would like to collaborate with industry peers, universities and other stakeholders to fast-track this, to develop a free-to-access, sustainable learning platform as a global tool to lift the capability of our technical professionals. Those modules can also be developed to equip our workforce with the knowledge required to manage the technologies that we're rapidly deploying. So we're thinking about 5 years in advance. Things are moving so fast. We obviously will keep reviewing that, but I think 5 years we've got a reasonable chance of understanding where we should be, and that will move, each year. This is a call to action, and And look, I'd be delighted to hear from peer companies and universities who are interested in joining us to build workforce capability to optimise our current and indeed our future risk identification and management. This could also be extended to additional undergraduate learning resources. This slide is just showing a few of the technology developments that BHP and I know other companies are now adopting. It's a different way of operating. So in summary, risk identification and management are critical to optimise the safe economic extraction of our resources, while we also meet societal, environmental and community expectations. Designing and implementing a system with clear accountabilities and processes and engaging diverse, capable, collaborative and objective stakeholders provides us with the insurance to mitigate both downside losses, but also to embrace the opportunities for strategic growth. Thank you.
Thanks, Jill. It was a really good insight into, I think, BHP's risk audit, risk management, and risk processes, and also a really good insight into Jill's role moving forward, and you can see the passion that she has for that. Does anyone have any questions at this stage from the audience? I think there might be a microphone at either end, so throw your hands up. Yes, in the front. I can speak just, perhaps. Or just give it 3 seconds. It will bring you a microphone.
Thank you. My name's Peter Bamford. You mentioned the need for collaboration and emphasised that again and again. You also, towards the end of your dissertation, mentioned a need to access in the cloud. I think whilst we all agree that if particularly the major companies were to share information of technological change, there would be universal benefits. But is this ever going to happen? Are you going to sit down and share your secrets with VO and a few externals? That's my query.
Yeah, look, it's, I guess if there's competitive advantage, you don't share. And look, each technology is assessed in terms of whether it does have competitive advantage, but it's also assessed in terms of sustainability. So that last photo, if I go back to it, that's real-time downhole assay tool that we're using in the Pilbara, and that is in advanced trials in Escondida in Chile. We recognise that if only BHP use that tool, it won't be sustainable. The company that produces that is Sodern out of Paris, and they need to sustain their workforce. So a tool actually has a reasonably long life, in which case they're not going to keep a group together to build tools if it's only for BHP. And so other companies have been absolutely invited to look at purchasing. Whereas there are obviously other areas where we would, and particularly in the areas of exploration, where we would be less reluctant to share technology, but concepts such as mineral systems approach to exploration. If we get collaboration with respect to e-learning, we already have modules in that space, and we would be happy to share those. It's because it's just really defining a different way of thinking. It's not selling trade secrets effectively.
One at the back there in the black shirt.
Thanks. Hi, Jill. That was a good talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just a quick question on, a lot of times when you approach a company like BHP, it's very large, and you hear that a group's got together to try and promote technology or something internally. You talk to them and you get passed off to the operations and it dies. Is it going to be a bit different this time if we sort of put our hand up to try and work with you?
Well, again, it comes back to, I guess, what we're really wanting to collaborate in is the training aspect. So the knowledge sharing that is actually going to build capability in specific areas. Collaboration in the actual technology development space is look. We are absolutely collaborating with some groups as I speak. I don't work directly in that group, but I have visibility of what they're doing, and I think again it really comes back to the individual problem that you're trying to solve. What's out there? Does it represent a highly competitive advantage? If not, yeah, they'd be prepared to talk for sure.
Thanks.
I think we've got time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Don't be shy. Yeah, in the front here.
Hi, Jill. My name's Jill. I'm from CITIC Pacific Mining. Just on that training of staff and all the rest of it, and the collaboration, are you thinking of like collaborating with the universities, particularly around that sort of AI development and sort of, continual learning for sort of, students as well as existing staff members?
Absolutely. In fact, there's 3 aspects really to my new role. One is training for industry members. One is actually looking at competency framework and minimum capability requirements for graduates coming out of the university system. So that speaks to those first 2 areas. And actually the third area is presenting a view of the industry that actually promotes enthusiasm from kids going through primary and secondary schools to actually come into the university system to ultimately enter the mining industry. I think, again, those 3 areas we all need to be collaborating on to get to the finish line faster. Someone was actually telling me the other day, first year mining engineering student numbers in Australia this year, I think there's 32 or 34. That's not going to sustain this industry. And so we actually need to be tackling all 3 of those areas to actually sustain our future. Absolutely, yes, planning to work with other companies. So I've had companies who've actually leaned in and said, count us in terms of being on board. I think once I get an understanding of who's prepared to do the collaboration, then we need to share, I guess, competency framework expectations, decide on a common one, and then go from there for each of those 3 areas.
I think we've got time for just one more quick one.
We've got one
before
over
we
there.
let you go.
Cheers, Jill. So I was wondering where, specifically along the resource valuation chain, you would see AI and machine learning giving the most value in, say, the next 5 to 10 years?
Look, we are internally developing something in that space. I think a number of other companies are as well. The ultimate aim within 5 years is basically real-time modelling and real-time, obviously, updates, feedback from process facilities, feedback. There has to be a big piece around uncertainty modelling as well. So understanding where we have less certainty, higher risk, therefore, as we get closer and closer to actually mining and extracting material. There is absolutely a time component to that. You don't want to do too much work up front. You want to do enough to answer the right question at the right time.
If everyone can put their hands together for Jill Terry from the HP.